taping this so that if somebody that was not able to make it to the training wants to participate, they can have access to it. Everything working? Okay. Chaplaincy is first and foremost a ministry of presence. It's being there. I mentioned in our question-answer time in December that you essentially cease to be Pastor so-and-so. When you're a chaplain, you represent the department. And that's a little different view of things. Now, yeah, you're still a pastor, but you're not specifically Pastor so-and-so. Because you're going to be in situations to represent the department, and maybe in sometimes to speak for the department. So you need to choose carefully there. You're going to have to earn the right to be heard. Officers are not going to just accept you just because you're a pastor somewhere. And they will test you to see if they can trust you. And sometimes that testing is, they'll say something about something going on in the department, and they're fishing. They're going to see if that's going to surface somewhere. If you're language sensitive or easily offended by what most people would call inappropriate language, don't do this. Cops are not known for Sunday school language. Your primary function as a chaplain is officer support. You will have contact in snatches with the public. You're probably not going to get a lot of jail calls. I don't know, unless they start bridging across into the sheriff's office, you probably won't have to deal much with the jail. It's real tough to deal with both sides of the bars. And usually when I talk to church groups, I try to explain to them when I say I'm a law enforcement chaplain, that means I deal with the people in front of the bars, not the people behind the bars. Now, the way our system works in Buffalo County, we do have contact at the jail on occasion, but even in that situation, my first responsibility is the corrections officers, not the inmate. So if you keep that focus that officer support is your primary function, you'll do fine as a chaplain. You will be in very tough situations when you have to make death notifications. Even in a death notification situation, your first responsibility is the officer and checking on them afterwards. You're going to find situations where officers are in some kind of crisis. They've had a really bad call. They've had a SIDS call. They've had a suicide. Unfortunately, we're not equipped with a delete button. And those things build up. And you have to watch out for the accumulation factor. You need to be aware of briefing room humor. It's a whole different thing. The public would be appalled at some of the things that are said in briefing and in the hallways. That's part of a survival technique for cops. And the public would view it as inappropriate, but it's part of how cops are able to survive, how they handle things. So with that in mind, let me just encourage you to ask questions. We're going to talk about a lot of different things. There's the first handout in your book. There really is a difference between a local clergy, a pastor, and chaplains. And I'm not going to read all of these things to you, but I want to highlight some things to you. Generally speaking, a chaplain has some training to deal with crisis situations that pastors don't. For example, as a pastor, I had been at the hospital and watched people die. I had been called to homes, immediately after someone died, after suicides. I've been on that gamut of things. I'd never knocked on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning to tell a family that their teenager wasn't coming home. It's a whole different game there. So there's some training, And there's all kinds of training, and I've talked some with Alan and some with the chief, that, you know, if there's other things that you see that we need to address, you know, I can come back and help you with some of those. You're going to be working in a very non-denominational setting as you deal with the public in brief contacts. I'll tell you this, and we'll talk about it a little more in death notification, but about 90% of the people that I have contact with in a death situation have no church connection. Nothing. Not even grandpa was a Methodist preacher or something like that. They got nothing. And that really changed from when I started as a chaplain, because then when I started as a chaplain, maybe 10-15% didn't have any kind of church connection, and now it's about 90%. And I have chaplains in other departments tell me the same thing. I don't know what that says about the church. Maybe we're not getting our job done. You're going to learn a lot of things about listening as you do ride-alongs. One of the most important things you can do is just let the officers talk. That's an important thing. Sometimes preachers are more accustomed to talking than they are to listening. You're not necessarily always going to be in a counseling mode, but you just need to listen. One of the things that you have to do as a chaplain, you got to keep your mouth shut. You're going to be privileged to information that the public does not have and probably should not have. And you will find people in your church may even pump you. Well, what really happened at that scene? And they'll pump you. And you just need to smile politely and nod and say, I really can't talk about that. You need to keep your mouth shut as far as what officers share with you. That's part of that trust factor. So there's a little higher level maybe of keeping your mouth shut than just being a pastor, because of the criminal things that you're going to see and be involved in. You know, I've seen and heard and smelled and experienced things as a chaplain I never did as a pastor. And you'll find that to be true as well. You become part of a team. It took about a year for me to move from being one of the chaplains to being our chaplain. And it took ride-alongs and being there and being at briefing occasionally in order to earn that. You're going to experience trauma events. Many pastors don't experience the kind of trauma that you may. You know, if you're called to a suicide scene and there's blood and brains splattered all over the wall. I've had to help carry bodies out of houses because there's a stairway or something and you just need extra people trying to navigate things. If officers ask you to do something and you're physically unable to do it, that's what you need to tell them. But pretty much the question for chaplains is, what do you need me to do? I don't know how the department's going to function. I don't know if they've set up any policies or guidelines or anything. They probably will do a background check on you before they allow you to serve as a chaplain. Most churches don't do background checks. Anymore they do, yeah. Yeah, there has been a time when they didn't. Anymore they... Yep. So that won't be a problem for you, I don't think, but that's just to make you aware. You may have to have a random test for chemical dependency. We hope pastors are smart enough not to do that kind of stuff, but you're going to be dealing with first responders of all kinds, police, sheriff's office, state patrol, depending on what the incident is, firefighters, paramedics. When they're called to a scene, you may be the contact for any kind of support. You know, I've spent time with paramedics. And sometimes they've called me, and sometimes I see that they need some help, and I go over and talk to them. And sometimes it's just being available. It's being there. That's that ministry of presence. It's being there. The department may request that you take be current on your tetanus shot and hepatitis B. It's not a bad idea whether you're a chaplain or not to be current on those shots. But, you know, there are some things different, and I always try to discourage people from referring to pastors as chaplains unless they actually are. Pastor, you're dealing with everybody. Chaplain, you're dealing with a very specific group. I got a hamburger last night at Wendy's, and I was wearing my jacket that's got POA and NSA on it, Police Officers Association of Nebraska and Nebraska Sheriff's Association, with handcuffs. And he says, are you an officer of the law? I said, no, I'm a chaplain. And he looked at me. What's a chaplain? No concept. We're a pretty well-kept secret. And I tried to explain to him it's sort of like being a pastor to the police officers. And usually I've been able to say, did you ever watch MASH? Father Mulcahy was a chaplain. What did he do? He provided support for the soldiers and for the doctors. This guy was too young. He hadn't seen MASH. So I've kind of lost my basis of explanation. But anyway, there are some very important things. I'm just going to, you don't have a handout specifically on this, but I'll just list these up here. There's a need to be available. Availability. If you say you're going to be there, be there. You know, if you're going to respond to on-call, however the department decides to do on-call, that doesn't mean in 3 hours. If they send out a page or they call you, that means they need you as soon as you can get there. It's with them. It's that presence. You know, Michael Judge died. He was with his firefighters. It's where he was supposed to be. He was with his sheep, if you want to call them his flock. But like I said, his death entitles you to federal benefits if you're killed doing chaplaincy. But it's being there. It's with them. It's, you know, and I mentioned this in our question answer time. You need to talk with your church. Make sure they're on board with you being a chaplain. Make sure they understand that, you know, sometimes people are very inconsiderate about when they die, and they die during church. Are you going to respond? How are you going to handle that? You know, we've had chaplains that have made it very clear, from this time to this time on Sunday, don't call me. We've had others who say, if the department needs me during that time, somebody's spiritual house is on fire, you guys sing some songs and have an offering and go home. You got to make that decision. And the department will be very understanding because they know you're a volunteer. I mean, I'm a volunteer. I don't get paid to be a chaplain. But being available is very, very important. You may get calls at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I tell you, there haven't been very many times when I wanted to thump somebody, but I've had to call pastors a few times in the wee hours of the morning, and they said no, they're not going to come to their parish member's house after a death. I said, please, Lord, just 5 minutes. That's all I want. Just give me 5 minutes. But you got to determine how available you're going to be. When I started as a chaplain, my captain said, you'll offer and you'll offer and you'll offer to officers, and at some point they might take you up on it. But you've got to be available. Another thing that is very important, another principle, if you want to call it that, is being visible. You know, if there's some kind of shift change or something, kind of shift change party or something, you're not talking a lot of time, but they need to have some facial recognition with you. And I can say that because in my department, we have a total of 6 chaplains. In my department, my officers, and we serve both departments, my officers probably can't name all 6 chaplains. They don't know them. The other guy, I've been trying for years to get the other chaplains to ride. Can't get them to ride. I've been trying to get them to come to briefings, come to when we have a meal for them. Hard to get them to do that. Now, part of that is a mindset that they see chaplaincy as a ministry to the public rather than a ministry to the officers. When I got into chaplaincy, I got in for the wrong reason. I saw chaplaincy as maybe a way to bridge into the community. That's not what this is. It's ministry to officers. And that's a whole different framing of stuff. And so kind of keep that in mind. But you need to be visible. Do ride-alongs. And I don't know if they're going to set up guidelines saying, expectations, how much you're supposed to ride. I don't know. They may do that. They may not. But ride-alongs is vital to build a relationship with officers. You got to be able to adapt. Because you don't know what you're getting into. I was riding with an officer one night, got a shots fired call. And, okay. And he says, okay, if anything happens, just duck down behind the engine block. I'm kind of going, okay. You never know when you might need to render some assistance to an officer. I might get in real serious trouble, but I'm not going to sit in the car waiting while my officer's getting thumped. Not going to do it. May not be much help, but I'm not going to sit in the car. You may come into a situation thinking one thing's going to happen and another thing happens. You may go in to make a death notification with a basic plan in mind, and you get to the door and you find out that the person that you need to notify is at the mall. Or you may not even get in the door. We've had that happen. So you may have to change very quickly. Like I said, the basic question is, what do you need me to do? One of our chaplains actually wound up keeping an eye on a murder suspect. Didn't know it at the time, but the sergeant at the scene said, kind of watch this guy over here, and they kind of separated him out. And it turned out he was the shooter. This isn't a fun and games assignment. It's a different kind of ministry. You're not going to be dealing with church folks for the most part, which from one of my chaplain's perspective is great. He sees chaplaincy as his outlet where he's not dealing with church committees, and he's not dealing with this Sunday school class, and he's not dealing with the deacons, and he loves it because it's not church folks. The other side of that is we had one chaplain who caught a lot of flack from his church because he was riding like once a week, and he was coming in at 10 o'clock to ride, so it's not like it's taking time out of his day. But they thought he was spending too much time with cops. Pretty bad when the church thinks you're spending too much time with unchurched people. About 80% of my officers are unchurched, so they've arrested too many church members. So you got to be adaptable. You got to be credible. They got to know they can trust you. If they don't know you, they're not going to use you. When that time comes, when they have that tsunami call that just nails them, when that accumulation factor finally kicks in and they need to talk to somebody, if they don't know you, they will not use you. I can guarantee you that. Cops by nature and training are suspicious. And if they can't trust you, if they don't feel like they know you well enough to trust you, they will not use you. And that's what this is about. It's about officer support. And anytime you come to a training that I do, you will hear me talk about officer support. because that's what this is. That's what we're about. The next handout in your notebook is Canons of Law Enforcement Ethics. Hopefully I don't need to talk a whole lot to you about ethics, but you do have, well, in our society there's just about every kind of philosophy and ism and religion and everything else, and you're going to encounter some of those. We're going to talk a little about clergy privilege later on. Clergy privilege is the legal description for confidentiality. Now, this is going to go far beyond your confidentiality as a pastor. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but what I want to tell you is this. At some point, get your county attorney, Alan, or your city attorney, whichever one that you'd be working with, have them come talk to the group about what fits and what doesn't. You know, I've had this discussion with our county attorney, and he has said, you know, here's your basic criteria. If you have any questions whether a situation is covered by clergy privilege, not confidentiality, and that's a hard transition for pastors sometimes. This is the legal stuff, the legal side, clergy privilege. The privilege actually belongs to the person. It doesn't belong to the clergy. And if you claim clergy privilege, you're claiming it on behalf of that person. And then you get into some ethics about at what point does that end. You know, does it end at the person's death? If the person gives permission, I would get written permission, by the way, to talk about it. But, you know, my departments know if I get sent to the jail, they're not going to ask me what the inmate told me. Now, there have been times when I've told an inmate because they started to tell me something that I'm going, I don't need to know this. You know, that I've told them, you know, it might be best for you not to tell me this because this is something I will have to report to the corrections officers. So kind of leave yourself an out there. But privilege is one of those things. This is not the time to try to build up your church. You may get some results. You may get some officers to come to your church. You may get somebody that you have contact with to come to your church. You may wind up doing a funeral from making a death notification. But this is not your primary evangelistic outreach to the community. This is officer support. You will have opportunity to share faith as you go with your officers, but remember your primary job is officer support. Any questions about this? Is just real general stuff just to kind of set a base for us. The chief mentioned probably at some point you're going to get photo IDs. Some form of identification is good. Our chaplains get a pocket badge. I had to buy my own because at that time the department wasn't furnishing basically anything. But there's something about this, putting a badge on. Not just, and I hope you get something like this. But there's something that communicates to officers, this person is willing to identify with me. This was very significant in that process for me. It bridged an initial gap. It gave me some initial credibility because it said, he's willing to identify with me. So some kind of identification is good. I don't know if you're going to have access to any money for training or shirts or anything like that. I don't know if you're going to have that. Too early to know, I guess. Our Law Enforcement Spouses Association bought jackets for us that say Law Enforcement Chaplain on the back. You need something so that when you show up at a scene, not only the officers, but the people that are there know that you are with the department. It's okay for you to be inside the yellow tape. So some kind of identification is very important. Look on there should be your next handout on clergy privilege and confidentiality. We'll talk about this just briefly. Again, I suggest, because every county is going to interpret things just a little differently, to be honest with you, the state ordinance doesn't use the word chaplain. It uses the word clergy. One of our chaplains has served as a pastor. He's not ordained, though, but we have a letter from the church saying he performs pastoral duties, therefore he can do this. The thing about clergy privilege is that really only clergy can claim it, be involved in it. To the point, and I've had it explained this way to me, that even like a deacon or something in the Catholic Church doesn't fit. A nun doesn't fit. You got to get it. I'm not going to try to tell you what your county says. You got to find that out for sure. But there's several very basic things. It is a communication. It's not nonverbal. It is an actual communication. Don't go in trying to interpret nonverbal clues. It's made in confidence to you. In other words, nobody else present. So if you and I were going to talk, and you were about to share something that you thought would be clergy privilege, if we were in this room right now, clergy privilege is out the window because there's other people here. If it was just you and me in this room, covered under clergy privilege until Alan walks in the door. And immediately, clergy privilege ends. I say this because if you're doing ride-alongs and you're sitting in the front seat and some suspect is sitting in the back seat, the officer gets out of the car to go talk to another officer, that person may say something to you. And usually the officer will identify you as being with the department, when he puts the suspect in there. But, I've had folks in the back seat, start talking to me, and I'm saying, some of the things that you're kind of brushing up against, I may have to share with the officer, and they'll shut up. You have to be acting in a capacity as chaplain or as pastor for clergy privilege to fit, as a spiritual advisor or whatever term you want to put on it. But it doesn't come into play very often, but you better have your backside covered when it does. Okay, any questions? We're going to look briefly at radio, and then we're going to come back and deal with ride-along protocol. I'm going to give you time to stretch your legs for a minute if you need to. But any questions? Okay, you have a Tin Code sheet behind the clergy privilege sheet. This is Nebraska Tin Code. Alan and I and the chief were talking about this earlier. Tin codes vary from state to state, sometimes from department to department. You don't have to memorize the Tin Code, but you probably need to learn some of it. Did it not get in there? I see you looking for it. Did it get there? Yeah. You found it, okay. I'm trying to locate it. It's in the right-along. Okay. Sorry about that. They didn't get all printed at the same time, so. No, there are too many different. Okay. Hastings PD is moving to plain speak, which is just saying, I'm somewhere. Come help me. This is what's going on. There's a robbery in progress. They're not going to use a radio Tin Code. I'm not real sure why Tin Codes came into existence, because so many people have scanners and they have access to the Tin Code. They could figure out what you're saying, but it's that secret police code stuff, But you will need to learn some of them, particularly if you're doing any crossover with the county and with State Patrol, if you're involved in any way. 10-4, message received, or I'm okay. 10-20 is location. 1065 means a probable death. if they put the J1 on it, that means there's an accident. If it's a J2, it's a suicide. If it's a J3, it might be a homicide, a felonious possibility. A 1044 is an accident, and a 1045 is an accident with injury. You will learn as you ride along some of the important tin codes. You'll also learn some of the subtle, not for public knowledge meanings of some of the tin codes. For example, 1090J2 means that the tower lights are burning, but they're out at the top level. The unofficial meaning of 1090J2 is, I'm dealing with a crazy person. The lights are out at the top level. That's just an example. I still carry a copy of the Tin Code in my billfold in the event that I would need it for some situation. But you will learn, and the best way to learn is to listen to radio traffic, or as you're riding with an officer, have it out and look at your sheet. You kind of familiarize yourself with it. A 1035 means there's some information, may mean a warrant. 1034 is a disturbance. 1034 physical is a fight. You know, you'll kind of pick up on some of those. There's some of them you may never use. There's some of them I've never even heard on the radio, much less used them. But just develop a working knowledge. And as you're doing ride-alongs, you'll be much more comfortable when you can understand what's going on. Okay, let's come back about 10 o'clock, give you about 7 minutes if you need to make a restroom stop. And then we'll talk about ride-alongs. And I can't emphasize ride-alongs enough to you. It's extremely important. And I'm going to give you some things to do and not to do on a ride-along with an officer. So take a little break, stretch